Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Black Mental Health Matters. I'm drkerryann Williams. I'm a psychiatrist practicing here in Massachusetts, and this is a show that's about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community and beyond. So today, I'm actually going to do a topic that's not necessarily specific to the Black community, but it is specific to what's going on in the world today and what's been going on for so many years. The topic is the mental health of children during times of war. And so kind of did a little bit of background reading because this is a topic that's been researched and studied, and there's a lot to learn and to share with you. But today's show is going to be brief. This is not going to be a comprehensive overview of mental health of children. It's just going to be a few things to think about and know about for children that are experiencing war and kind of the post-war recovery. So according to the International Review of the Red Cross, there's an article called Living Through War, Mental Health of Children and Youth in Conflict-Afflicted Areas. They reported that there's an estimated billion children living in war zones or areas that have been affected by war. And that's as of August 2019. So that was even before the pandemic. Now, while going through these experiences of kind of living in these areas, children often don't even have access to psychological services. And during wartime and in refugee situations, children often endure abuse of various kinds. And, in the old days, there was this kind of belief that children wouldn't really remember much of what happened and that they're just so resilient that they would just bounce back really easily. And the reality is that, as you might expect, there's actually a high rate of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. Now, some children, they'll experience an initial stress reaction and they might not necessarily go on to developing PTSD, but a large percentage of kids will develop PTSD. So let's talk a little bit about what can happen to the mental health of children during wartime, because so much can happen. So of course, according to research, children can experience depression and have had shows in the past about how to recognize signs of depression and what depression is. But again, of importance is that there's a higher risk of suicide as well for children going through difficult circumstances. They can also develop anxiety disorders like panic disorder and separation anxiety from parents. And very commonly, children will develop sleep disorders and chronic nightmares. Young children, I guess children in general, can also have regressive behaviors. Regression occurs when stress causes a child to suddenly behave in a way that's much younger than their actual age. So for example, a child may suddenly start to have episodes of wetting themselves, or what they call enuresis. And that's after they're at an age where they've already been trained for how to use the bathroom. What we call in America, we call it potty training. After a child is potty trained, they may regress and start having episodes where they're, wetting themselves again. That's a sign of regression. Or you may have a 10-year-old that's throwing tantrums that looks kind of the way that a 3-year-old's tantrum might look. They're showing these regressive behaviors. These are things that children do when they're under a lot of stress and when they're traumatized. There's another thing that can occur, and this is thing that's called dissociation. And this is where a person can psychologically disconnect themselves from the present. It's something that kind of happens involuntarily. Initially, it's the mind's way to protect itself from the intense psychological experience or the intense psychological trauma of a situation. But then afterwards, that psychological dissociation can continue to happen and it can become an ongoing condition. And they can experience flashbacks. A flashback is like this intense psychological experience where a person suddenly relives a traumatic experience that they went through. So it's kind of like they time travel in their mind. And this was something that people started to see often in soldiers that were returning from the world wars. Basically, the soldier might be at home, they've returned, but they will wake up in the middle of the night thinking that they're still under fire, they're still under attack. They might be telling their spouse that they need to put on their gas mask. They're just kind of living in a moment that occurred in the past, but they feel like they're still there. That's a type of dissociation, and that can lead to that's what we call a flashback. Children may be afraid to sleep by themselves because they're having scary dreams and they're having these scary memories. And especially if they're having dissociation and feeling like they're reliving something that's happened in the past that's traumatic, they may be scared to fall asleep or scared to sleep by themselves. They might be afraid of the dark, things like that. The other thing that dissociation can cause, because remember I told you it's a bit of like it's a disconnection from what's going on in the present, but it also can be a disconnection to a person's kind of internal experience as well. So what you can see is like an emotional disconnection that can occur. So what will happen is you might see a child who's explaining what they experienced in wartime, but when they're talking about these intense experiences, they appear very detached emotionally. They express very little emotional range. And they're talking about atrocities that they've witnessed, but they just have no emotional reaction while they're speaking about it. That detachment could be a type of dissociation that occurs during times of trauma. And again, it initially starts off as the body's kind of way of protecting itself from that intense psychological experience. But then over time, it just continues and it can become a problem because then it kicks in involuntarily and people disconnect even when they don't really mean to. Now, as a result of war and life as a refugee, children can also develop severe behavior and conduct problems, becoming oppositional to adults. They can start to normalize the events going on around them because that's their life. That's what they've been living. And they may have difficulty seeing the future beyond their current circumstances because, again, they don't have a lot of examples, a lot of reasons to kind of believe in a different future for themselves. Because remember, sometimes conflicts can span the entire duration of someone's childhood, or it can span the time of a crucial kind of stage in psychological development. So maybe it spans somebody's entire adolescence, or it spans, age 6 through 12. And when that happens, there's a normalization process. The child begins to accept that this is what life is like, and they start to normalize it. But it also, trauma has a way of affecting a person's ability to regulate their emotions. It kind of is a shock to the system. So children have difficulty kind of regulating their emotions. And they also, because of that lack of safety, they can sometimes begin to feel like adults can't keep them safe, and they start to get oppositional and have conduct problems. So it's just a lot of behavior issues that can occur when kids feel traumatized during times of war. Now, if a child already had a vulnerability to a mental health condition, maybe something they inherited, then the trauma of war can cause them to develop that mental health condition. If they already had a mental health diagnosis, the trauma of war can exacerbate it or make it worse. Then, apart from the war itself, apart from the conflict itself, if children are displaced, they may also face stigma and rejection in the new country that they have migrated to. And especially if there's that history of like racial or kind of ethnic persecution, this can be a big problem. This stigma and discrimination has a significant influence on the mental health of children because children are still psychologically developing their sense of identity in the world and their sense of belonging in the world. So this is a really big blow to their mental health. Then, of course, human rights violations can occur during these times of war and conflict and migration. And so there can be denial of access to adequate resources, when people are kind of being rejected, pushed away. No, you can't come here. There's a denial of access to necessary resources, and there's poor living conditions. That adds to the trauma that children can go through. Sometimes just due to the sheer number of refugees leaving a country, it can be a challenge to keep up with the access to basic needs. Even if people wanted to help out, sometimes the need is so overwhelming that people still end up lacking the basic needs that are important. And so lack of access to basic needs like food, clothing, shelter, safety, these sorts of things, these are one of the biggest determining factors of a child's mental health during wartime. And the poverty that can result from surviving war is a major stressor. And I just wanted to add in here, because I think sometimes we forget about this, is that children are particularly vulnerable to being trafficked during times of war, conflict, poverty, migration. Children are particularly vulnerable to being trafficked. So just remember that that is also a risk that can destroy the life of a child if they're not rescued. If they're not if the trafficking isn't intercepted and the child isn't helped. Then if there's long-term displacement, children go on to become emerging adults who then have to face issues related to sometimes lack of citizenship in their new country. That presents problems of its own and can be re-traumatizing, because again, it's like this feeling of not belonging, this feeling of rejection, that they've been living in this place for X number of years and they still kind of, they feel stateless. They feel like they have no home. Lack of choices, lack of freedom that can come along with migration can lead to feelings of powerlessness and depression and other kind of mental health issues. And then there's substance abuse. The trauma of war can increase a long-term risk that children will develop alcoholism and other problems with drug abuse. So that's just, again, something that happens to both adults and kids, is that you may see these higher rates of a higher risk of subsequently developing substance use if there's access, alcoholism, and other drug use. The other interesting thing I wanted to mention that can happen with mental health and during wartime is that there's research done on Holocaust survivors that showed that the trauma they experienced caused certain genetic kind of changes that could actually be passed down to future generations. It's called epigenetic changes. And this is significant because trauma not only increases the risk of psychological issues or mental health issues, but it also increases the risk of medical problems. So what we know from a study called the ACE study is that there can be increased risk of heart disease and diabetes and obesity and these sorts of things in people who have experienced childhood trauma. People who have experienced trauma as children can sometimes go on to develop pain syndromes and gastrointestinal problems and even autoimmune diseases. So, trauma causes inflammation in the body, which increases the risk of physical illness. So there's both, mental health considerations, but also physical health considerations for children going through times of war. And this kind of adds to the needs that children have. So I wanted to kind of just move into what are some of the things that help children and even, teens and adults, because some of these things that help kids will also help families. Okay. So one of the things to really, really emphasize is the family system, family support. So a child's connection with their family can help to buffer the experience of trauma during wartime by providing that crucial emotional support. Emotional attachment creates a sense of psychological safety for children. So all efforts should be made to prevent the separation of families. The disruption of families due to separation is one of the biggest kind of determining factors of what's going to happen with a child's mental health during wartime. Now, sometimes it's unavoidable. Sometimes one of the parents is lost to a violent conflict, or maybe they have to go and serve in the military. So, it's sometimes unavoidable, but where it's possible, whatever can be done to minimize separation of families should be considered. The other thing to kind of think about is that even when families stay together, they're going to need family interventions. It's important to know that trauma in families can also increase the risk of domestic violence too. There's a risk of intimate partner violence, and there's a risk of child maltreatment within families as well. Remember that the stress of trauma can lead parents to change their parenting style. The parents are going through their own struggles. They can become irritable. They can become angry. They're going through their own psychological detachment, their own psychological issues, and that can reflect in their parenting and can lead sometimes to intrafamilial violence. So mental health providers may work with children individually, but the family as a whole also needs mental health intervention. And it may be helpful for parents to receive specific parent-focused interventions if available. The second thing that children are helped by in times of war and this kind of crisis is acceptance from the people around them. So a feeling of a sense of positive community surrounding the child. That can help them to adapt to difficult circumstances, and it can buffer that blow to their development of self-identity that comes from rejection and from stigmatization and persecution. A sense of belonging is really, really important for child development. And especially since war often leads to displacement, we have to put additional effort to helping children adapt to new circumstances and feel like they belong and feel accepted in a new place. As I mentioned before, this feeling of displacement, this feeling of not belonging, the feeling of rejection is a big blow to a child's developing identity and their mental health. The third thing I want to talk about is something called Tfcbt, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Again, according to the article that I had cited earlier in the International Review of the Red Cross, Tfcbt, or trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, was offered to children as young as 5 in Zambia in a study, and that caused a significant reduction in trauma symptoms and helped their overall functioning greatly. I want to just talk about what Tfcbt is. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is a specialized intervention for the treatment of trauma. And it has a lot of components to it. So, I'm really massively summarizing it here, but it basically kind of builds up to this final trauma narrative. So it includes education, parent meetings to go over parenting strategies. It includes relaxation techniques. The child learns how to talk about their emotions. They learn how to identify and describe what they're feeling. They learn how to effectively and safely express their feelings. Children learn how to adaptively solve problems and how to build social skills. And importantly, they learn how to manage intense emotional states, and they learn how to manage traumatic grief. And parents can also receive help with managing intense emotions as well. And this is part of the therapy. And eventually the child may end up sharing their narrative, their trauma narrative, with the parent. So the parent has to be able to regulate their own emotions around hearing that. And there's skills that the child learns, including how to manage the negative thoughts, that onslaught of negative and pessimistic thoughts that trauma can bring on, especially during times of war. And then where there's traumatic grief, which again is, who doesn't have losses, right? There's traumatic grief. Children and parents will need education about the grief process and to, talk about the confusing feelings that they may have about the losses that they have. and also how to preserve positive memories of the person or persons that they have lost. And as I said, there's so much more here. And it addresses a traumatic grief that inevitably, as I said, who going through this kind of situation doesn't experience, multiple losses. So traumatic grief is an important target, and trauma in general, and TFCBT is something that's specialized to help with that. The fourth thing that I'll mention is something called NET. It's narrative exposure therapy. And when it's done with children, it's called KidNet, so NET or KidNet. And basically, narrative exposure therapy is helping survivors to develop their trauma story, the story of what they've experienced. Basically, their narrative is a story of what they've experienced. And for a child, their narrative could be spoken out loud. It can be written. It can be in the form of drawings. And one of the differences is that with the other therapy I mentioned before is that narrative exposure therapy is usually done with small groups, and it's really specialized for use in refugee camps. Each person in the group kind of tells a story of their life. There's particular attention to the trauma experiences. The group leader helps to prompt details about the feelings and thoughts during their autobiography. And what the narrative does is it helps to place their trauma memories in context. So what ends up happening often when people have traumatic memories is that they just have these kind of flashbacks that occur and just elicit intense emotion. And what this narrative exposure therapy does is it helps to tether these individual, what they call hot memories. It tethers them to the greater context of the experience, what they call cold memories, which are the other details of what happened in the person's life. So it kind of connects these intense memories to the greater context of what they went through, and it reduces the symptoms of trauma overall. It's really an effective intervention. As I mentioned, it's narrative exposure therapy. When it's adapted for use in kids, it's called KidNet. The next thing that is employed in refugee camps and in places where people are migrating are just child-friendly spaces, which I refer to as CFS, child-friendly spaces. These are, this is a direct quote from the article. It's a designated safe space in refugee camps. And here children can access free and structured play, recreation, leisure, and learning activities. So it's particularly helpful for very young children in refugee spaces. I had read another article that mentioned that as children get older, as they become teenagers, these child-friendly spaces are not necessarily as helpful. But for young kids, there's a lot of evidence to show that it's very helpful. Children need a sense of safety to develop the way that they should. The other thing that's going to be needed is access to educational services. So, in the initial shock of everything, education is not necessarily the priority, but, many times when people migrate to a new place, they end up kind of staying out of their war-torn kind of areas for an extended period of time. And at some point you have to kind of resume educational services to children. It's really important. And sometimes mental health services can be delivered via an educational setting. So education facilitates so many facets of child development, and it promotes a lot of skills that are necessary for the development of the brain and the mind. The other thing I wanted to mention is spiritual beliefs. Okay. A strong connection to a religious faith serves as a buffer to trauma. So religious faith provides so many of the things that trauma survivors need to heal. So it may offer a context for the concept of justice. It can offer a context for the concept of what it means to be free. But it's also a place to discuss the meaning of one's life experiences. And this kind of search for meaning is a really important part of the journey of a person who's experienced trauma. And religious faith tends to offer a space to discuss meaning. Faith groups are also helpful for the development of identity as a person. And so, especially in a situation where a child may be displaced or may be feeling rejected or stigmatized or persecuted in a new country, um, these faith groups can provide a place of belonging and a place for you to develop your sense of self. Um, and it also provides hope in a situation that is designed by the perpetrators to crush the spirits and crush the hopes of the people, of the civilians. Religious faith can offer hope in dark times. And it also provides hope regarding life after death. Many religious faiths will have an explanation for kind of what happens after death. And so, in situations of war where losses abound, hope in life after death can help protect against the complete hopelessness and pessimism that can occur with some of the losses that happen in war. So the other thing I'll just say about what helps children and what can be helpful for children, all responders that are helping survivors of war should be educated about the effects of trauma and how to work with individuals who have experienced trauma. And throughout the years, people and organizations that work in war zones have done research and have learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work. So I looked some of these up myself to prepare this podcast today. So here are a few examples of some mental health interventions. And these ones are, some of them can be done by, volunteers can be trained to do some of these. Some of these can be done by specialists. But the first I'll mention are various kind of mind-body exercises. So that could be things like meditation, mindfulness, and guided imagery. The other are like body-based interventions. And trauma is held in the body. So interventions that involve movement of the body can be healing at this non-verbal level. So that can include things like dancing or acting, doing drama and things like that. The other thing I'll mention is just in general, nonverbal or minimally verbal interactions. Trauma is difficult to describe in words because trauma is felt. So using art like drawing or painting, using music, this kind of thing can be healing. As I mentioned before, the great thing about some of these interventions is that they don't necessarily require a lot of advanced training. So volunteers can be taught how to help facilitate, some of these things like the dancing and the drama and all of that. And also some of these interventions may not directly feel like traditional mental health therapy. So people who might otherwise kind of stigmatize traditional therapy, or they might reject traditional mental health kind of clinics, they may be more open to engage in a community-based activity that we know it engages a mind-body connection, and it helps them heal from trauma. And so these are considered kind of like level 1 interventions. They're kind of can be implemented at a group level. They can be administered by people that are not necessarily highly specialized or highly trained. And it doesn't require a lot of use of oral narrative where someone has to talk about what happened or necessarily write what happened. But the other level, after this would be needing someone who's specialized to deliver specific kinds of therapies and who have more advanced training. And that's going to be necessary as well for a lot of people. The other thing I want to mention is that in this digital age, where possible, virtual access to specialists can occur, via video calls. And so particularly if we're looking for specialists to train people on the ground to deliver the trauma interventions, this is more possible these days. And it's already being used in certain places. So in this way, specialists can increase their availability to more people because they're not necessarily locked into one physical location. They can be available digitally in multiple locations. So to wrap up, guys, the children make up about half of the refugees worldwide. And as survivors, children face many sources of trauma. There are a lot of strategies already studied and used in established refugee camps and other spaces where survivors reside. The most important starting point is meeting basic needs for safety, food, clothing, and shelter. Consistency is also important because if there's inconsistency of having basic needs, that's traumatic as well. And children will need continued education resources. They're going to need a sense of acceptance and belonging from their immediate community. And where possible, they need to stay together with their families, and the families should receive mental health interventions. And first responders should have training in the effects of trauma and training in how to communicate with children and adults experiencing trauma. So, what are your thoughts and suggestions? Drop a comment below and let me know. I'm going to leave you guys today with a video from the UNICEF website that I kind of liked. And other than that, it'll be it for Black Mental Health Matters. I'll talk with you again next week. So let me share this video with you. All right, see you guys next time.